Welcome to Drinks in the Library, the only library where drinks aren't just allowed, they are required. I'm your librarian host, Gigi Howard, and each episode I'll be interviewing a guest about a much-loved book that we will be pairing with a drink for you to enjoy along with us or consider for your next book club meetup. As always, stay curious and support your local library. Good morrow, Libration Nation. This week we are stepping back in time to the court of Henry VIII, diving deep into Hilary Mantel's masterpiece, Wolf Hall, which was recently named as the third best book of the 21st century by the New York Times. And we are unraveling the complex character of Thomas Cromwell, digging deep into the historical context of Henry VIII's reign, and marveling at Mantel's meticulous attention to historical accuracy. My guest this week is the wonderful Valerie Adachi. Valerie is a self-declared bookworm who found joy in reading cereal boxes as a kid and still gets nostalgic about spreading the New York Times across her kitchen table. She recently completed her second master's degree just for the love of learning, and she has an insatiable curiosity which embodies her passion for continuous growth. Valerie and I had so much fun and such an interesting conversation discussing this book. We also paired it with a whiskey neat, and we got a bourbon whiskey from Oak and Eden. And I had never had a whiskey neat before, and I was amazed at how delicious it was. And it paired so well with this book, which as I'm watching the leaves start to fall from the tree outside my window, this time of year, I can just see someone, cozying up with Wolf Hall, pairing it with a whiskey neat on a gray and cold fall day. So just a reminder, if you're enjoying the show, tell a friend, tell a family member, and maybe tell a stranger. So, all right, without further ado, let's dive in. Thanks. I don't know. It's been the whole experience.
How's the whiskey?
Yeah, let's start with the whiskey. I'd had a little bit before. Just when I opened the bottle, I took a sip.
Yeah, it should be like warm and almost buttery, mellow.
I don't drink whiskey enough.
Yeah.
So what are our tastes?
This one kind of flowers once you taste it, and it has to sit there a little bit, and then you can taste it as well.
It's like in my sinuses.
Mm-hmm. It's nice because it feels like a friend. Oh, I like you. It's not like an indifferent drink. You might not like it, where it's just like, this is not for me. It's too bold or strong, or I like something fizzy or bubbly. Yeah. This is a perfect day, too. Because once you said that to me, this is my favorite thing to drink. Uh-huh. I usually drink it at night as like a nightcap. Mm-hmm. But today on a gray kind of day, it feels, and this book feels like.
Yeah.
Did you read it a little bit?
I did. I read the whole thing.
You did?
Yeah.
Did you love it?
I loved it. It took me a little bit to get into it. And
there's
I think
a lot. It's very meaty.
Yeah, it is very meaty. But yeah, so going to the drink, and we're connected through your sister-in-law. Oh my gosh, someone's texting me like jokes. But yeah, so we're connected through your sister-in-law, and she's mentioned that you're a mixologist. Is this true?
That is a fairly large stretch, I would say. I have a bar cart from Target. I usually keep like the basics, and then I mix up if I like a gin better. My younger brother was in Scotland for a while, so I was pulling some Scottish gins and putting them on the cart. They also have friends that are gin makers in Richmond. Yes. So there's a local gin maker, and I had a drink last night with their gin in it, and they're very close friends.
Yeah. But yeah, so you would slightly embrace the mixologist.
I do. I have it at the holiday times in my neighborhood. We're a new neighborhood, and you were mentioning how much you love your neighborhood here. Because we all moved into our homes at similar times. It was like, oh, hello, welcome.
Right.
So we have a small group of neighbors within our little circle by proximity, and we have parties that we invite each other to. And so I have I call it, this is a little terrible, I call it the New Year's Eve party because I don't want anyone to feel obligated to stay till midnight. Because everyone has their own things to do. Small kids, they want to celebrate and go out, or they want to party. So I have a New Year's Eve party where everybody comes for cocktails, and then everyone can go home at a decent time.
That sounds amazing. That sounds perfect.
Yeah, so we've had that 2 years in a row.
Okay.
So it's fun. So I think that'll be my go-to.
And yeah, I love that too because New Year's Eve is like pajamas. Maybe we'll we usually stay up, but I mean, I'm not a partier.
If you went to a party, you would feel like I have to stay till midnight, and your hostess, myself, would be falling asleep, wishing everybody had gone home already. Hence the New Year's Eve. You would probably come to my New Year's Eve, because you'd be just like, I can go home.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
So I think sometimes we have to strategize. Like, we want to celebrate these events, but maybe not in the traditional sense. We can open it up that way and be flexible and have everybody enjoy themselves still.
And you suggested this whiskey. It's Oak and Eden. And you said small batch.
Yeah. So
now, what's the difference?
Small batch is usually referencing makers where you can actually point to like the people that are behind the scenes making this concoction, and where they're small enough that it hasn't been outsourced yet or bought up by a big conglomerate. So this particular whiskey, as far as I know, is still relatively small. They make it in small batches. So there's like a quality control where the makers have a hand in it. And I think as everyone is trying to find their niche as they mature through life, that to support people that are really finding that value and opportunity to maybe make part of a living at doing something that they love and creating a great product to send out there in the world. So if I can find a maker that I like, there's a maker called Beacon Mercantile that I also love. She does like home scents, and she had a beautiful little store right next to the train station in Beacon, New York. And I walked in, and she's like literally behind the counter introducing all of her fragrances, but she created all on her own, all these very unique fragrances, and she named them after a lot of New York State things like the Catskills and different places in the area. And I still, for Christmas, I still order a big order. She does beautiful candles, and it's nice because you can go to Pottery Barn or Target and buy very commercialized things, and they're all fine products. But I think that when it's coming from someone who really built it out of love, there is a nice opportunity to take. You think you appreciate it a little bit more. You know the hard work that went into it. You know how much work it is to wash your dishes at night. So when someone has made a product for you in their kitchen or in their small wherever area, I think it's nice if you find those quality products. I mean, you don't want something that's like terrible just because your brother made it.
Yeah, that's so true. I love that viewpoint of care towards people that are doing things they're passionate about. Awesome.
This was also,
I'm really loving it.
This whiskey was also in conjunction with the people that promoted it was a small band that I followed for years, and they did a collaboration with this whiskey. So that's actually how I found it, because I followed the band.
What's the band?
It's Jamestown Revival.
Oh, okay.
And it's interesting. They're calling it alt folk country, this blend of music that I particularly like. They have a wonderful live show that's incredibly engaging, but they haven't toured since they had a show that was canceled right at COVID, at the beginning of COVID, and I've seen them a few times live, and they are the creators behind The Outsiders on Broadway right now.
Okay.
So they wrote all the original music for the Broadway musical that just won all the Tonys.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so it's cool how you can follow someone from something very small.
Yeah.
And as each, person grows, they leave this trail of other breadcrumbs for you to find. It's really fun.
Yeah, and I think I have the segue into the book from what you just said, because Hilary Mantel, and we're going to be talking about Wolf Hall, her magnum opus, I guess. She started small. I think she would write food reviews.
Oh, okay.
And film reviews, and that sort of how, but she was always doing that to hopefully feed in her love of historical fiction. So yeah, you start small, and then you won the Booker Prize twice.
Yeah. I chose this particular book because I've read it multiple times. I'm a fast reader and I love to read, and I'll have a very opinionated idea if I liked it or not, but I might not be able to recall everything. But because I've read this book so many times, I felt like it would be a good one for me to talk about, because otherwise I'd be just like, I liked it. I don't know why. So this one, there are probably a few things that I can actually tease out that why I like it and why it resonates with me.
Okay. So when was the first time you read this, and what was that experience like?
I think I read it when it was first published. So I think it was published almost 20 years ago. Is that correct?
I think it was 2009, 15.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I read it when it was recently published because I'm a big library patron.
Oh,
we were living in a small town in New York, in Rockland County, and we have a wonderful library system in Rockland County where you can just order online, pick up your books, return them at any branch.
Yeah.
And I had read it. So I read it in hardcover, which is not my favorite because it's so hard to carry around.
Yeah. But paperback wasn't out yet, though.
No.
Right. Yeah.
And so now I have a system where if I love a book, it's in hardcover from the library, a big library supporter and patron.
Yeah.
But then I'll order it in paperback. So then a year later, when it gets published in paperback, it just comes to me because Amazon does that. And you're just like, oh, this is so great. I love this book. I'll read it again.
Aww.
So it's a nice way to keep it going. Because your library books are free. You do those tiny bits of things to support your authors. And
yeah. I did. Obviously, I get a lot from the library. But my thing is, like, at least like once or twice a month, I purchase books or whatever. And then do thrift books, too. That kind of thing. But
my brother says that those are the things when you go to the music concerts that you have to buy merch because that supports them. A lot of the T-shirts and the posters and all of that. The musicians, teachers, everybody's underpaid. Musicians go out there and they're on the road and they're self-supporting. They don't have health care. They don't have all kinds of stuff that you think they probably do because they're out there. But a lot of them don't have the infrastructure just the way that our country is built here on healthcare management. Yeah. Not to throw that in, but
I hear you.
So I buy the merch. I buy the posters and the books and the book signings and the T-shirts and the book totes and all that. Support our musicians, too.
Okay. Wonderful. And I would say Wolf Hall, this is the Thomas Cromwell story, right?
Yes.
Like, this is like the premise. So guide us through. What's the story about?
So the story is really about, it's taking very well-known pieces of history and using a fictional account to take a character that was on the sidelines and historically maligned, I want to say, where Henry VIII, and everyone knows the story of his 6 wives and what happened to them in the end. But this is a gentleman who doesn't start out as a gentleman, who starts out as a ruffian. He starts out from like the very working class. His father was a blacksmith. And he rose through the ranks, really, I think at that time, on his own steam. I should have a better word for that. Especially because in the history with the monarchy and the landed gentry, that it would be, you would rise up through family, through court, maybe not necessarily from your own contributions to society. Yeah. And so Thomas Cromwell, Hilary Mantel presents him as very industrious, very learned, very active and engaged. So at the beginning of the book, it opens with him being beaten by his father, and he takes this as a very young man, not even early into his teens, where he takes himself out of England to find adventure and work, and he thinks that the way to find this is through wars, because everyone is in acquisition, and this is a paying position. And it doesn't matter if you're from England. If you go to France and you say you'll fight for France, then you will get paid as a soldier. So he worked his way up until he had some sort of quality and quantity of life and ended up back in England and rose through the ranks to end up being Henry VIII's right-hand man at a very important time in history when he was trying to break from the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
As he was trying to obtain a very dicey divorce after being married to Catherine of Aragon for 20 years. But he was still a young man. They were married young.
Yeah.
In that time. So he was in his 40s, and he did not have an heir. He did not have a male heir. Yeah. And that was the agenda.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of the story is built around the central drama between the church and the king, right? And so he backed himself into a corner with his marriage to Catherine of Aragon because Catherine was married to his brother.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So do you want to expand a little bit on that and what the implications were for him?
From Henry VIII?
Yeah, from Henry VIII.
I think that Henry VIII, at that time, he needed to have a male heir to continue his line. He was only the second Tudor king, and relative to his father's reign, his father had to fight for everything, and I think Henry grew up very without want.
Yeah.
And he was younger. His older brother, Arthur, was first married to Catherine, and she came with the crown of Spain. So she was the Spanish queen. And so she came with so it was supposed to strengthen ties between England and Spain. And when Arthur died prematurely, Catherine was in limbo for a while. And part of, I think, the text Hilary mentions is that Henry's father doesn't want to send her back to Spain because he doesn't want to lose her dowry. So they keep her in limbo for a while and somehow manage to get permission from the Catholic Church that Henry and Catherine are able to legally wed despite her earlier marriage to his brother. So a lot of that hinges on whether they were so young when they were married.
No, she was like, I think she married his brother, but I think she was like in her early 20s once she married Henry. And he was a teenager.
Yes. I think the problems when they're attempting to absolve the first marriage are that they're trying to prove that there was no consummation of marriage between Catherine and Arthur. Yeah. And so this goes on to be like the talk of the town, and with Catherine saying that she is legally Henry's wife, and Henry is saying, you could never have been my legal wife for the 20 years we've been together because you were really truly just married to Arthur.
Yeah. And I think another thing I found is interesting thinking about this story, which, like you said, I've known about it for so long, but is the implications of what's going on. Martin Luther had just nailed the 95 Theses, in the last 20 years or so. I think I wrote it down, 1517. 1517. And so that was a huge deal. I don't think that people today really can think about what the implications were, and they were because I was reading, they were talking about Tinsdale. They all hate Tinsdale. And I'm like, who's Tinsdale? And he was the first one to write the Bible in English. And that before that, because Martin Luther said everything shouldn't be just in Latin, we should have it also in our own languages so the common man can understand it. And so,
correct. So I think that is really where Hilary Mantel uses Thomas Cromwell's voice to explain history to us, because he says, where does it say in the Bible that there's Pope? Show me where the Pope is in the Bible. Yeah. There's really interesting text or a lot of interesting ideas that she puts through Thomas Cromwell's voice. And so he had been he was a worldly man, and so he was friends with both Catholics and Protestants and was very learned. He wanted to know what was happening in the world, and he sounded what's the word I'm looking for? That he was a man of reason more than of religion or of religious conviction, where he would ask, where is some of this knowledge coming from, and using that, as you said, the English word, so that the common man could read and understand for himself what was in the Bible, rather than having a cardinal or a bishop tell you what you believed.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, she did a really good job of painting that picture in a way that you're like, And when you hear things in history class, it just doesn't impact you of this happened this year and this happened that year. You think of all the drama, and I think she really...
I think that's the wonderful part of it, is because then the history plays out in these characters, and you can see the conflict. So Anne Boleyn, Henry's area of interest when he was trying to leave Catherine, was Protestant. And so there's a huge shift in the dynamic of the church. And so Henry ends up being excommunicated by the Catholic Church. So now when we think back to the Church of England and Protestantism, and we almost... I, growing up, didn't really realize how that split happened or when it happened. And people believe what they believe with fervor.
Yeah.
And a lot of it comes from mankind.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's really fascinating. I think in religious fervor, you can believe everything was ordained by God and comes from God, and this is the word of God. And then you look and see the handling of man, how man has touched many of these things and built many of these edifices according to their own plans.
Yeah. In the book, it's almost like lawyers who go through legalese or whatever. They're going through the Bible to try to justify things. And it's, would Christianity as we know it today exist the way we know it if Henry VIII hadn't wanted to have a son? It really would have.
Had a son with Catherine.
Yeah.
It would have been very different.
Yeah.
If he had many boys with Catherine, would he have needed to? Would he have made such a huge split? But because she was in her 40s, not able to have any more children at that point in time, she wasn't an option for him anymore.
Yeah.
So she was very stalwart, and she never gave in to the divorce. He shunned her. He put her away. She didn't live in poverty, but she certainly wasn't treated as the queen.
Yeah.
And then they just moved into her place,
Right.
even, before any of the official things, because he really, the agenda was to get a son.
Yeah. And reading between the lines of the story and what Mantell is trying to tell us, the role of women, like you just said, Catherine's just pushed aside, Anne's put in. There's other females in this story as well. Is there anything that you think she's trying to say?
Oh, interesting. I was so fixated on Thomas. But I love her portrayal of Thomas's wife and how he speaks of her and remembers her, because she dies very early in the novel. Spoiler, but she's a Superman
All of this is on
character.
Wikipedia, so.
She dies of the plague
Sweating
or the disease,
sickness,
one of the horrible diseases back then. And she doesn't concentrate a lot. She does a little bit on physical appearances, because we're told throughout the story that Thomas Cromwell is not particularly an attractive man.
They call him like the Wall or something.
Yeah, and there's one where he's painted by the famous painters of the time, and when he sees his own portrait, thinks that he looks like a murderer. And his children think that as well.
They're like, you didn't know this?
Yeah, that's exactly. You didn't know that about yourself? But again, very different, right? We're very used to a society where we're selfie. We know what we look like at that time. I think there's one part in the story where he comes back from first meeting Anne Boleyn, and his household, all the women are saying, what does she look like? Is she tall? Is she small? Is she big? Is she... Because they don't know what she looks like, because there's no way to obtain the physical look of someone, because they would be miles apart. There's no photography. You would go by word of mouth or a portrait. And they ask her, one of the women in the household asks if her teeth were good. It was a sign of, I don't know, health, wealth. And he says, I will let you know when she bites me.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember that line?
I do remember now the biting
so
part,
good. And you're just like, oh. And I think those are the lines. She comes out with these very clever ways to say things that just strike you as just not ordinary. You know, she was very intuitive, and you could physically be there and see that exchange happening, I think, because she makes it accessible, even though maybe reading about England in the 1500s isn't maybe your thing, but she makes it, like, again, accessible and real, and I don't know, I just found it so fascinating.
Yeah. I also thought it was interesting, and I have to admit I read some commentaries, so I didn't pluck all of this from thin air, but so Thomas More is another character in the book, and he's a saint in real life. Like, he's a saint, he's canonized, and he's the Catholic stalwart against everything that Henry's wanting to do.
Correct.
And I know for A Man From All Seasons, he's always depicted so positively, but in this book, he's kind of the villain or the bad guy.
I think he's a little bit of Thomas Cromwell's nemesis in the sense where Thomas Cromwell, I think, will use things to his advantage to build a home where he didn't have one, to be a father when he didn't have a great one, to serve his country as he could. He wanted to standardize. And
he's the Alexander Hamilton of this.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, that's interesting. And so I think that he's not drawn by his spiritual nature or fervor. And when Henry splits from the Catholic Church and they become Protestant, I think it's very much talks about sides of which side are you on, and I think she can put a bright light on those that would just turn whichever way. They needed to be on the winning side. There were many of these in the noble families where they would be all for Catherine, and then they're all for Anne Boleyn, and then after Anne, they're all for next in line, because the families, their homes, their livelihoods were very dependent on the grace of the king. And Thomas More, being a man of the cloth, he had very strong religious convictions and became a martyr for them. And I remember, and I think this is where she paints Thomas Cromwell as sympathetic when he's, just tell Henry and he will give you grace and he won't execute you. And Thomas More stayed true to the faith, to the original Catholic faith, as did Catherine. And they weren't going to sacrifice I believe their entire belief system was not going to be swayed by the politics of the time. Yeah. It's admirable. It's also a little dumb. You know what I mean? Yeah. You're just like, is it that important?
Yeah, it's one of those. I think we're all different. And there's some people that is integral to their system, and then there's other people that are like, this is not the hill I'm dying on, literally. Yeah.
My son and I, interestingly, went to London a couple of years ago, and they do have a little place near the castle where they believe Anne Boleyn was beheaded. I think that's a little ahead of our story, but
okay. Also
not unknown.
Yeah,
but it was interesting that I guess because she was the first of what became of Henry's multiple wives after that. Many of them didn't last more than a couple of. I mean, Catherine, when you look at it, was his wife for 20 years before he went astray.
Yeah, he went a little crazy. And I was looking up, and I knew the names of all, like Anne Cleves, Catherine Howard, Jane Seymour, but I didn't know all the stories. And so preparing for this, I was just kind of like looking through it, and I was like, Catherine Howard, they were married for like 1 year, and she was like 19, and he killed her.
Yeah. Well, I think too, as you're looking at and she also paints. Standard of the times, I think these are not probably the girls' choices.
Yeah.
That, I'm going to marry the king. That's at that point he had she calls them separating wounds, which sounds really yummy. And they talk about how he's like morbidly obese at this point. He's quite unfragrant.
Yeah.
And he plucks some 19-year-old girl because he still needs the heir.
Yeah.
And then when she's unsatisfactory because she's been found to be with multiple other gentlemen pursuing her own pleasures. Supposedly.
Yeah.
And then he's used to hacking and at that point.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting. But Anne, I think the focus on Anne is because she probably doesn't get enough credit for how smart she was in her own right.
Yeah. And that is a lot of the book is her, I wouldn't say the protagonist, but she's definitely one of the main characters.
I think because she's really, I think some of his later wives were just next in line or in his line of sight.
Yeah.
But Anne held out from a lot of historical records. She didn't roll over easily and she never consented to become his mistress, which would have been standard of the time.
Yeah.
If you just wanted the jewels and the elevation and the recognition, you could do a lot of things without breaking from the church, I think.
Yeah. And this is the first of a trilogy. Have you read the other two?
I have.
Okay. So the next one, I have always wanted to read. The next one, I wanted to read it because of the title, Bring Up the Bodies.
I know, it's so good, right? Because this is where it all starts happening. So the next one, the first one is really about him getting Henry what he wants at the end of the day. He wants to be done with Catherine. And he doesn't want to be bothered with it. He doesn't want the chatter of Catherine's not feeling well. She's getting close to dying. And they had a very good marriage for many years where he never left for war or hunting or to another house without saying goodbye to her. And at the end, he doesn't pay attention to her at all and sends her off, and she dies alone with her own small household. And the Spanish ambassador, I think, is like the last people, and her own personal chaplain that are with her at the end. Thomas Cromwell does go and visit her and pleads with her to give Henry. Again, I think he's like this negotiator. He's trying to give. I think he sees where the cards are going to fall. They're, as with Thomas More, right? If you don't change your mind, you will be executed. I'm going to try and give you the olive branch. I think there's another character, another cardinal, that can we not leave this behind? Like this bickering. They were two favorites of the cardinal.
Yeah.
And the other gentleman says, no, we can't. So he's, okay, then this is the way it's going to be. Like, then we'll just be at odds.
Yeah.
But I think she portrays him as trying to be this negotiator that he was as he made his way through life, trying to learn a trade. I like particularly when Henry asks him, can you tell me how much I cost today? Because he knew the price of cloth. He knew the price of everything. And so he would feel the cloth, and he would know this hue at this particular time is very costly. The yellow that Anne Boleyn wears at one point was an unheard of color that didn't happen very naturally in natural fiber. So it was a very costly fabric, and she was the only one at a particular ball to have this particular dress color. And so there's a lot of history woven into the clothing and manners of the time, I think.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite character in these stories? I mean,
well, I love Thomas because she presents him as such, and he's such an underdog, and he's a little ugly man, and he's so powerful. I think the reason why he comes across so well is because she doesn't present him as vain. Yeah. And I think many people that become very wealthy or powerful oftentimes are presented as very vain and egotistical. And I think it might be in the second book.
Okay.
Where he's hawking, and he sends off the hawks, but they're named after his daughters. Oh. So he sends Grace and Anne out. Yeah. And so to get back to the women, I think there are a lot of women that are portrayed much more in her book than in history, because he talks about his daughter that wanted to study Latin.
Yeah, and that was unusual for her to be in. Yeah. I was thinking so much through the story, and I mean, we're both women. If the church or if the monarchy could just have accepted that women are able to rule and are as competent as men, none of this, once again, would have happened. He had Mary right there, and who knows what that dynasty would have looked like.
But interestingly, Elizabeth I, which is his daughter from Anne, and I haven't read anything about her for a while, but she was a very strong monarch and never married, probably because of that history behind her. Right. So that had she married, she would have become secondary again. And she had opportunity, obviously, had men falling at her feet, wanting to be.
Yeah.
And she chose to stand alone and be the Virgin Queen and rule without heir.
Right. I think, like, it's one of those things, it's like God laughed at them. It's, oh, you want to make all of this about having this male progeny? Guess what? One of the most famous queens or rulers of all time is a woman. And good for her.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I wish, sadly, when Hilary Mantel passed, I was so sad. I think her novels made history come alive. I think so many people have. It reflects in her 2 bookers, and the New York Times just put out the 100 books.
It's number 3.
I know. And so I was like, guess I'm in good company. But she really is. The story is fascinating in itself, but she has such a creative, wonderful way of bringing the times alive in many different ways, in their language, in their dress, in the relationships they have with each other. And there are very few authors that could match that. I think she was tremendous in her eye for seeing things, but what would resonate with people, I think.
And I think that she was very passionate in writing these. And from what I watched an interview with her, and she was just talking about how when she's writing, that is her focus to a point that other things don't happen.
I admire authors that I have tried to write at different points in time, but I come across I probably would be able to write maybe the daily blot, when small newspapers have like small crime, like the chicken, someone stole their eggs. I could probably do something about that. But the way that she writes, I write very trite and very specific, and my language is not expansive, but she has such a broad use of language and brings in so many different components that it's not typical syntax that you would learn in school. It's very imaginative and creative. She's just a wonderful writer. If you've never read Hilary Mantel, she is such a treat. And she's the type of author, I feel like, when you read her book, you wish you'd never read it so you could read it for the first time again.
Yeah. And like you said, sadly, she passed away in 2020. But she's an English author. I think she had moved to back to Ireland. I noticed she was not happy about Brexit.
Brexit wasn't a good idea. I'm just going to say that. From an expat, I actually am Canadian.
Oh, okay.
But I live here.
Okay.
I maybe that is part of my historical interest because I grew up with the monarchy.
Okay.
We used to sing "God Save the Queen."
Yeah.
And we were in London just after the Queen passed, and that was my whole life, is knowing Queen Elizabeth II.
Yeah.
So the monarchy is probably more prominent in my life than maybe the average American, because I grew up in Canada. So I do love a good monarchy story. I love the Tudor times because there's so much going on there.
In Canada, do you learn like English history in school?
No, it's been so long.
I'm just curious because I was thinking, I was reflecting on, I did like European history, but
so Canadian history or Canadian government is based more on the British government than the American government. So we have a prime minister, and the prime minister becomes the leader because he's the leader of his party. So you don't vote for. Theoretically, you don't vote for a person, you vote for the party. Whoever's leading the party becomes the prime minister.
Okay.
And we still pay homage to the Queen. We have a lieutenant governor, which is the representative of the Queen. So everything legally, I think, follows still some of these channels. So I think that's part of where that history for me is interesting.
Okay.
Because we grew up singing to the Queen every morning. So that's part of the Canadian history. That, again, back to Brexit. I don't know. So sad. But they are forging their own history. Everything is I guess everything just keeps moving forward, and
we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Going back to the book, though, I think is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to talk about?
This is such a wonderful story. I had I've read it multiple times, and I started, as you can see, I had started to tag a few things, and I'm still partway through. I hadn't finished everything. I love how, in making Thomas Cromwell a real person, how she concentrates on his family home.
Yeah.
I guess that's one thing I think that's really interesting. How he didn't have any sons, but he had young men like himself when he was first starting out come into his household. He could also identify, she gives him the identification of younger men that have potential and brings them into his household.
Yeah.
So I like how he builds a family.
He adopts all these men, basically, and makes sure they marry well.
Yeah. And she also portrays him as very generous, that the leavings from his kitchen, that his household gets fed, the kitchen staff get fed, and then the beggars get fed, and he throws coins out when he leaves and enters his dwelling. So she portrays him as very generous. I think that she gives him I don't know if he was like a non-entity in history in a sense that people glossed over him, but she really fleshed him out.
Yeah.
And they built the BBC did a series.
Yeah, I watched you can watch the first one on YouTube without paying. So I did watch it. Yeah.
And again, just hats off to Hilary Mantel. I think the series is accessible if you are a more visually attuned person, because they do very great costuming.
Right.
But again, there's so much in her own language, in her own words, when you're reading the book where Thomas Cromwell really comes alive. I like the series, but I love the books.
Yeah. And one thing that I wanted to make sure I mentioned was that she was very fidelitous to the facts when writing this story. And she didn't want to write any scene where if you looked up in history, someone who was in the scene was actually in another part of England. And I thought that was wonderful.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of thought. I think that's probably why it's stood the test of time, is because it's creative, but very valid and true in its own. It can stand on its own legs, just in fact. And then everything else that she gives that Hilary Mantel delivers to it it's glorious. Her use of words and turns of phrases and making people come alive is just so wonderful. But I think it stands. It's such a great story, pivotal time in history, and she brings a different... We can only just guess at really what happened in rooms, the room where it happened.
Yeah. Exactly.
But she gives us pause to think. Were people more well-rounded than we think they were? And gives them another opportunity to be looked at with fresh eyes.
Yeah. And last question I always ask is, who would you recommend this book to? It's historical fiction. Who do you think the ideal reader is if you're...
I like the idea when you bring up women. I think that it is complementary. I think there's a lot of complementary characters that show a lot of courage. I think you can even say that, you can specifically say that with Anne Boleyn, where she stood her ground a lot against the king, and she wasn't coming from queenage, from any component. She came from a good household. So women, anyone that is interested in history, because I think, as you said, it's factual, so there isn't any, you won't be led astray and say, oh, things happened, King Arthur's Knight's Table, or Camelot. So it's very factual. It's just a fascinating history. She's such a great read. If you want something that is just very robust and meaty, this is a great read in front of the fire in the winter. If you haven't read it at all and you're going to start, it's a trilogy. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Anyone that loves, I think... It's like the New Yorker magazine. They have writers that can write about truck drivers on their cross-country hauls, and you're just like, that is so fascinating.
Yeah.
I've never thought about that.
They flesh out people, whereas a lot of times we stereotype someone so we don't have to think about it.
We don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
And Hilary Mantel is of that caliber of an author that even if you have no interest in English history, you're going to come away with knowing some English history.
Yes, you will. For sure.
At the very least.
Yes. And I do want to say, so I sincerely think that the whiskey neat is a great pairing for that. I love smelling this.
Yeah. It's yummy, right?
Smells so
you
good.
could probably have a bath in it.
Oh, yeah. Or wear it as like perfume or something.
I think my maker makes something that has a little like tobacco whiskey smell. She does a leather smell.
Yes.
She made a beautiful, Tony, this is a call out to Beacon Mercantile. She made a beautiful fragrance specifically for her husband. And then he wore it. And everyone was, please make that for us. It's called Wool Blanket.
Okay.
And it's really cozy, and she makes it in a room spray, and she made it originally as a perfume for her husband.
Okay.
But it's so nice and yummy when it's a rainy day or starting towards autumn.
What's the name of her company?
Beacon Mercantile.
Okay. Definitely put it in the show notes.
Nice.
Yeah.
Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful, and you got me to read Wolf Hall.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. So
all right. One convert.
Thank you. All right. I'm going to push. Thank you for spending some time with me and my guest for an episode of Drinks in the Library. For more information about the show, you can find us on Instagram at Drinks in the Library, on the World Wide Web, drinksinthelibrary.com, or shoot me an email at drinkspod@gmail.com. Until next time, cheers.